couple things today. First of all, I will not be in lab today. I'll go and unlock the door, and you're welcome to go in if you want, but I won't be there. If you have questions about something you're working on, please email it to me. But otherwise, I will not be in lab today. Okay. Let's pick up where we picked up last time, and that was different kinds of layouts. So far, we've seen 3 forms of layouts with CSS. Let's run down them quickly, just to review. Our first layout that we saw was just using the flow and not changing the flow at all. So we did nothing with the positioning of these things other than setting margin, padding, border, and so on. We didn't do anything with the position. And as we imagine, these things are then stacked up on top of each other. The blocks are stacked up on top of each other following the flow layout. So if you don't do anything to change the layout, you get the flow by default. In this example, in example 2, we have an absolute layout. And that is where the things on the page are positioned in exact positions using the top and left coordinate and the position value of absolute. All right. So it doesn't matter what the window does. If you scroll through the window, if you make the window bigger or larger, it's glued into place. And that's called an absolute layout. We saw, in our most recent example, we saw a fixed layout. And that is where we can lock certain things in certain positions. So, for example, we locked the navigation and the header at these positions on the page. And if you scroll, even if you scroll, they don't move. And that is a position of fixed. All right? So those are the 3 layouts that we've had. As you can see, each one of these, how do I want to put this? Each one of these, can make for a good, nice layout. As we've been going through this, we've been doing other things with CSS as well, just as a way to learn more CSS. So we'll continue doing that for a few more different layout types. All right? The next layout type that we're going to talk about today is called relative layout. And I have a version of the page ready for it in which I've taken out all the CSS. So there's no CSS in this one. And if we look, the page is going to look just as we expected with the things stacked up on top of each other, following the block model. All right. I'm going to, just so that we can see these things, I'm going to put a border around each of these. So I'm going to put a border around the header. I'm going to put a border around the nav, the section, and the footer. I'm just going to do this just so that we can see those things more clearly and we know exactly where they are. Okay, so when we do this and look at this page, that's what we have. All right, again, I didn't do anything with the positioning in this, so things are stacked on top of each other. Now, what I can do with relative positioning is I can take this flow layout and tweak it just a little bit. All right? In other words, let's say I want the banner across the top of the screen, the navigation over here, and this section right alongside of it, and then the footer right underneath it. So I want a layout where there's a banner, a navigation, the section, and the footer. I could position each one of these elements. That's what I did in the fixed layout example. In the fixed layout example, I positioned each one of these elements to get that. If we look at the CSS for this, for each of these elements, you'll see I have a top and a left and a position absolute. Really, though, another way to look at this problem is that with this layout, all I want to do is scooch this guy to the left and up. All right? So this is where it's normally going to go. I want to change it from where it's normally going to go, and I want it to be a little bit scooted over this way and a little bit up. So let's try making the CSS to do that. So I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to make, for the navigation, I'm going to make the width 200 pixels. And the section, I'm going to make the top 150 pixels, the left 250 pixels, and the position relative. All right, I'm not doing absolute. So it's not going to glue it down in any particular place. It's going to take where it normally would be and push it over. Made a mistake here. It should be a negative number. 150 pixels up and 250 pixels from the left. So if I look at this now, this is what I get. All right, not exactly right, but I could play with that to get it right. Maybe make it like that. It's almost right. Let's push it down a little bit. Been good. All right, let's say that's good enough of where I want it. All right, now if we look at this, that footer is still where it normally was going to be, right? Because all I've changed is this. So I have to push the footer up a little bit. So I can go footer, and that'll push it 125 pixels up. So I'm left when I'm done with this. And that's sort of a different way to achieve the same goal as this, the layout. But I did it via a relative positioning instead of an absolute positioning. Now if I want to, I can get rid of the borders. because as you can see, the borders were just there for us to get a sense of where these things were. And once it served that purpose, if I don't want the borders, I don't have to have them. So that's a relative positioning. So far we've seen three values we can put our position to. Absolute, fixed, and relative. Absolute means that it's going to put it at that point on the page, and it will stay there, and it will scroll with the page. So this example is absolute. If we look at the CSS for that one, we've put these down: top 10, left 10, position absolute. Top 180, left 10, position absolute. It takes it at places and it glues down those elements at that place on the page. And again, the page, relative to this 0, 0 corner. And if we scroll up, it moves. It moves with the page. That's absolute layout. The next one that we did was fixed layout. And that's where we glue it down with respect to the window. So these two things stay exactly in that place even if we scroll. And that's accomplished with a position of fixed. Position fixed. Top 10, left 310. The navigation, top 10, left 10, and a position fixed. Finally, we have this relative position, where we take the flow, where these would normally appear, and adjust it. So normally this would be under here, so we want to push it to the left and push it up. So I use a negative value for the top and a positive value for the left that will push it from the left and towards the top. And I define position relative. So the nice thing is if I add some stuff here in the header, if I add a paragraph of Greek text, let's say, in the header, if I add the Greek text in the header, with the relative method, I don't need to make any other adjustments. Everything just pushes down from there. If I did that with the fixed layout, these things would still be stuck in this position, and as this expanded, it would go over and cover some of that up. So let me show you what I mean. Since everything is glued down with the absolute position, if I add something, then the sections of my page are going to interfere with each other. All right. Notice how they overlap. I didn't have that problem with the relative because the relative position says, hey, take where you would normally put this and make a small adjustment to it. So if where I would normally put that section, I change by adding something in a section above it, then I don't have to worry about that because it will be adjusted accordingly. So I'm going to take that out so we're not messed up again. There, we're back to normal. All right. So that's 4 ways of doing our layout so far. We're going to do, I think, 3 more. We'll get probably 1 more of them done, and we'll do the other 2 the next time. The one more that we're going to do is called floating. And I'm going to make an example, a separate example for floating, so we can isolate and just look at floating before we look at it on our actual prototype. So I'm going to put my CSS right inside this page instead of having an external file, just to keep things simple. And I'm going to start off with just 2 sections. Okay, and I'm going to make 2 copies of this section. Or what the heck? Let's live large. I'll make 3 copies of this section. Now, I'm just going to put some basic CSS in here. For now, just to put a border around stuff. All right. So we look at this. That's what we'd expect, right? The 3 sections stacked on top of each other. I have CSS to put a border on them, but other than that, they're stacked up vertically. Sections are block tags, which means that they're blocks that extend across, by default, 100% of the screen, unless we go and we modify it. All right? So, now I'm going to start playing around with the size of the sections. All right? I'm going to go in here and I'm going to say width (200 pixels). All right? So if I do that, have the same thing, except each of them are now narrower. And I can make it bigger if I want to. Let's make it 300 pixels. All right, there we go. Okay, everyone okay with that? They're still stacked on top of each other, but I've changed their width so they don't go all the way across the screen like they do by default. Yes?
So then if you actually had them, all three of these, in the same section, the same line, it would actually put all three of them going vertically across.
No.
But if they're in the same line in a single section,
If they were in a single section, it would look just like this, except there'd only be a border around one of them. So let me take out the extra section tags. Everything's in one section now. If we look at it, it's like that. All right, so let's go and achieve what you have described, though, because that sounds like something we might want to do. Because if we look at this, we see that there's plenty of space, at least on this monitor, to put them side by side. All right? Now, so far we've seen 3 ways that we could do it. Or a couple ways. I don't know, a few ways. We could change the relative positioning of these two and push these to the left and up, just like we did in the one example. I could put in a constant and do an absolute position and put these here. I could probably even do a fixed and glue them to that spot on the window. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a float command. And let's look to see how the float command works. I'm going to say float to the left. And let's look to see what that does. All right. Now, notice what it does. It puts them side by side. But notice what happens when I start resizing the window. As I make the window narrower, there'll be a certain point where it can't fit all 3 of them side by side, and it drops them down. I can't fit them side by side, so it drops them down. This is called a floating layout, sometimes called a liquid layout. Okay? Now, let me put headers in each of these to make it more clear what's going on. So I put section headers in each of these. I come and I look, there's section 1, section 2, section 3. As I make it narrower, right now at this point, the screen is probably 900 and some pixels wide. All right? Because each of these are 300. All right? And if I add that extra, that would be 900 and some. As I narrow it, once this gets less than 900, I'm no longer able to fit section 3 alongside of section 2. So it drops it below. Finally, when I get it past 600, it no longer can fit section 2, so it puts section 2 on its own line and section 3. So this is how floating works when we float to the left. And you can float other directions as well, but I think floating to the left is the easiest one to visualize. If there is enough room to put this next element next to the thing on its left, it will do it. If not, it will put it on the next. It'll put it below it. So it's either going to put it next to the thing to its left or below it. In this case, all three of these can fit on the same line. So it puts this one next to the one on its left, this one next to the one on its left. All of a sudden here, we can no longer put this guy next to the one on its left. So we put it below. Doesn't fit to the left, so we put it below. And that's what floating is, in a nutshell. Now, here's where things get complicated. Because remember that the padding, margin, and border all add up to form the width of something. So if I start putting padding and margin in here, I might not be able to fit all these side by side even when the screen's full. And maybe if I need a bigger screen to put them all side by side. So let's go and do that. Let's go in here and I'm going to put a border of 4 pixels solid black. I'm going to put a margin of 5 pixels. And I'm going to put a padding of 5 pixels. So that adds on to it. And sure enough, with that layout, there's not enough space to put section 3 alongside of it. Well, there is if I go to full screen. But as soon as I make it a little bit narrower than the full screen, boom, it pops down. If I made a big enough space like that, they wouldn't fit next to each other like this. So you always have to include the border and the padding and the margin. Now, here's something tricky about the margin. The margins actually collapse. So if I say a margin of 15 pixels, that's 15 pixels all the way around, each element, each section. So it's 15 here, 15 here. But between these two, notice it's only 15. You might think that it should be 30 spaces between those two, right? That there should be 15 pixels to the right of section 1 and 15 pixels to the left of section 2. And add them up and say, well, there should be 30 pixels. Margins don't add up. All right? When you say there's a margin of 15 pixels, that simply means there has to be at least 15 pixels between the two. And if that's satisfied, it won't add the other 15 to it. So both of these boxes satisfied their margin requirements because both of them are 15 pixels from its nearest neighbor. It doesn't add it up and say, okay, it has to be actually 30 pixels between it and its nearest neighbor. That's called margin collapsing. So margins collapse. In other words, they don't really add up. All right. Now, one thing that we could do, in addition to using an absolute number of pixels, is we can use a percentage. So I could say, for example, the width of each one of these is 20%. And if I do that, then the width of each of these is going to depend on the size of the page. When the page is bigger, these sections will get bigger. When it gets smaller, these sections become smaller. So notice with this particular values, section 3 never goes down below section 2. Because there's always space to put it if it's only going to be 20% width. What if we change it to 30% width? Well, it doesn't do it right from the start because, now you might think 30% times 3, that's 90%. It should always fit in 90%. But remember, we have to add the padding and the margin and all that for each of them. Whenever it says 30%, it means 30% of the available area. So if there is 1,024 pixels going across, it's 30% of that. Let's change the margin to be just 5 pixels so that we can fit these side by side when the screen is. All right. There's the 30% with the 5 pixel margin, the border, and the padding fits. But if we make it smaller, they will reach a point where you can't fit it in. One thing that you could do that's valuable as well is do a minimum width. So for example, notice how narrow that gets. We could tell it we don't want it to get any narrower than 200 pixels going across. So we could go in here and say min width, let's say 200 pixels. If we do that, then it will take it as 30%. But once we get past a certain size, it doesn't resize it anymore. All right, because we've set the minimum width. It won't get any smaller than that. All right. Now, sometimes you have the case where you want to treat one thing differently than the other things on the page. Or maybe you want to treat a group of things differently than the others on the page. All right? So for example, let's say section 1 is the most important section. All right? That's something that we want to make sure that the user reads. The other stuff is less important. Now, how do I specify that section 1 gets this style rule, but the other two sections don't? If I just change it to say section, then everyone gets that style rule. All right? What I can do instead is I can say, I can put an ID in this. I'm going to say ID most important. I'm going to identify why I want to treat this differently. I want to treat this one differently because this is most important. I can then define a style rule for things that have the ID of most important. So, I could go in here and say, how do you specify you mean an ID? With a pound sign. So notice when I do section like this, that means any HTML tag that is a section. When I say pound sign, most important, that is anything on the page that has an ID of most important. So I could go in and I could change everything I wanted to about this. I could change the border to be wider and red and dotted. Okay? I could change the font size to be a little bigger. And so on. And now it's a little bit bigger and it has more prominence than the other stuff on the page. Again, notice what I'm doing here. I'm not just making things look on the page for the sake of them looking different. All right? I've defined a reason why this is going to look different. It's going to look different because it's the most important part of the page. And therefore, I'm going to use visual cues to help show the users that. All right? So that users could see that that section is different than the other section. And it's human nature, if you think of headlines in a newspaper or text on a sign, it's human nature to think of the bigger stuff as being more important. All right? So if you see a newspaper article and there's a headline this big and there's another one with a headline this big, you're going to assume the one with the giant headline is more important. Notice what I did also. I did a couple of different things. I made the text bigger. I made the border red instead of black. And I made the border dotted instead of solid. That way, if there is someone viewing this that's colorblind, they're not able to distinguish the fact that that's a red border, or they might not be able to, depending on their kind of colorblindness. But they can tell that that's dotted instead of a solid line. So you see that it's different. All right? Now remember, people tend to equate things that look the same and see things that look different as having some difference to that content. So in this case, the bigger font suggests that this section is probably more important than the other sections, whereas the other sections are more or less equal. All right? If section 3 was something that was like less important, then maybe we could make the font smaller or something like that. Questions about this? So some of you asked the question, what if I want everything but a certain thing on the page to look a certain way? You can use an ID. Now here's the thing about IDs. An ID can only be used once per page. Let me rephrase that. It should only be used once on a page. If you use an ID more than once, you're asking for trouble. All right? Like if you think of a student ID. How many people have your student ID number? Only one, right? An ID isn't valuable if it identifies, well, it might be this person or it might be that person, right? You give somebody your driver's license. Yeah, this is Fred's driver's license. Well, Fred who? I don't know. This is a driver's license for everyone named Fred, right? Doesn't make sense. It has to identify a unique person. And an ID has to identify something unique. By unique, I mean only one. All right? Sometimes people in conversation use the word unique incorrectly. They'll say, wow, that's a unique jacket that you're wearing. Strictly speaking, you could only call a jacket unique if it was the only one that existed in the universe that looks like that, right? Because if there was two that look like that, it's no longer unique. Unique means just one. Now, what happens if you have things on a page that you want to look different, but there's more than one of them? For example, let's really make this more complicated, and let's put 6 sections on this page. Okay? How this looks, let's say these two, this is the most important one. The rest of them are all sections, so they all look like this. Okay. What if section 2 and 5 are a little different? All right. Let's say section 2 and 5 are ads, for example. And we want our ads to look different. I can define a class. And notice that the class starts with a period, not a pound sign. And I can define the style rules for those. So maybe for ads, I'll give it a different font. I'll make the font smaller. I'll make the color of the font blue. And let's just stick with that. So which sections did I say? 2 and 4? 2 and 5, I think? I guess it doesn't matter. I'm going to give section 2 and 5 a class of ads. What's the difference between a class and ID? An ID has to be unique. Whereas a class, you're allowed to have duplicates. Okay? So, if we go and look at this, it It did 5, it didn't do number 2. Let's see why. Forgot the quote. So, section 2 and 5 look different because they have a class assigned. Section 1 looks different because it has an ID assigned. And all the rest of them follow the rule for section. Now, this is how CSS is called cascading style sheets, because these styles cascade, right? In other words, I defined a rule for section. The rule for section was that it's 30% width and has a black border and what else? It floats to the left. All of these sections have that except where I overrided it. So adds has all of that, still has a black border, and I overrided the color of it and the font size. So adds gets everything that's in a sections style rules, plus it gets the additional ones that are on the adds. The ID gets everything that is in the section style rule, but it gets the extra stuff that's defined on the ID. So if we were to look at this, padding of 5 pixels, I don't define the padding for most important or adds. Well, because they're also sections, they get the padding of 5 pixels as well. The only thing where there's difference is where I define and I override for either the ID or the class. And generally speaking, the more specific you identify something, the precedence it takes. So in this case, the ID is just for one thing, that takes precedence over the class. If I make this smaller, things start to move around. Now, it might seem a little goofy how things move around, right? That's one of the actual benefits of web design compared to other sorts of graphic design. Graphic designers in the past did things like make brochures and make magazines and book layouts and things like that. Well, when you buy a magazine, everyone buys the same size magazine, right? So you go and buy Time or Newsweek or whatever, and it's a certain size. It's going to be a certain size for everyone that buys that magazine. When you view a web page, however, different people are going to be viewing that web page under different circumstances, namely how big the screen is. All right? So CSS allows us to write pages that are smart enough to know the size of the monitor that it's being displayed on and adjust the page correspondingly. So, if I'm on a big monitor, if I was on a real big monitor, maybe 4 of these things would fit across. Well, maybe not in this case because I said 30%, right? But if I'm on a big monitor, they could all fit next to each other. If, however, I'm on a narrower monitor, maybe I only get 2 columns. Now, this will become important when we start considering doing design for mobile devices, because it's great to be able to make the page look different if we're displaying the page on a mobile device versus displaying it on a desktop device or a laptop or whatever. Okay, I'm going to save and post this example. Thursday, I will finish up the floating part, and we'll get into probably the other two layouts that we're going to talk about. Grid and, what's that called? Flex flow or something like that. Okay. I am not going to be in lab. If you have any questions, please email them to me. All right, and we'll see you Thursday.